Hello, and welcome to Heilman Haver, the Stage and Screen podcast, coming to you from Casa de Quinn and 1111 Studios in beautiful Port Orchard, Washington. I'm Greg Heilman.
And I'm Matt Haver. We're two local actors looking to hone our craft by exploring the best in local theater and on the big screen. Each week we bring you entertainment news and views, celebrate classic Hollywood, enjoy cocktails with a Tinseltown twist, interview talented local actors and directors, and chat with industry experts from LA to the UK.
Today is Friday, January 21st. Happy 2022, and welcome to episode 56. Joining us today is Kaytlin McIntyre, Associate Artistic Producer and Director of Casting and New Play Development for the Seattle Rep. With the new year comes the excitement of a whole new lineup of plays and musicals hitting Seattle stages, and in just a few moments we'll chat with Kaytlin about her role in the Rep's upcoming season and the groundbreaking one-woman show playing now, Fannie, the Music and Life of Fannie Lou Hamer. Stay tuned.
And it's not just in Seattle that new shows are hitting the stage. Right here in Kitsap, Central Stage Theater, or CSTOCK for short, presents Roald Dahl's Matilda, the musical. Check out Greg's review of the show, available now on our Facebook page, and catch the show at the Kitsap Golf and Country Club in Bremerton through Sunday, January 30th. Tickets, including dinner theater tickets, are available at cstock.org.
Right here in Port Orchard, Western Washington Center for the Arts is hitting the ground running with Love or Marriage, a collection of one-act plays by George Bernard Shaw and directed by our friend Kristi Ann Jacobson. Best known for Pygmalion and Candida, Shaw used his theatrical works to discuss social attitudes and criticize the English stage. Get tickets and more info at WWCA.us.
And as many of our local listeners might remember, back in 2019, everyone's favorite horror comedy rock musical, Little Shop of Horrors, was slated to hit the stage at Western Washington Center for the Arts. Yada yada yada, global pandemic yada yada, and auditions for Little Shop Take 2 are at long last happening tomorrow, Saturday, January 22nd. No gardening or botany background required, just prepare 16 bars of a song that's a verse and a chorus, and brush up on your cold readings, limber up for a dance step or two, and join the fun at noon at 521 Bay Street in Port Orchard. And don't forget to feed me.
Seeing as this is a Stage and Screen podcast, most of our listeners are probably familiar with the casting process at the community theater level, and if you tuned into our show back in March 2021, episode 20, you got the inside scoop on casting for film with Seattle-based casting director Jody Rothfield. But how about professional theater?
Back in early December, we met with Seattle Rep Artistic Director Braden Abraham and Artistic Producer Elizabeth Farwell Moreland for an episode of Get to Know a Theater, which we hope you'll check out on our YouTube channel. We chatted about the history of the Rep and recent renovation projects, plus the Rep's philosophy and method for choosing shows. Today, we get to dig a little deeper into how actors are cast and new plays are developed.
Kaytlin McIntyre is a director, producer, and casting director based out of Seattle, and is an associate artistic producer and director of casting, and she also heads up new play development at Seattle Rep. She grew up outside Kansas City and was introduced to theater by accident, driving her dedication to reaching new audiences with accessible and magical stories. When she's not in the rehearsal or audition room, you can find her out on the hiking trail, and she joins us from her home in West Seattle. Welcome to the show, Kaytlin.
Welcome.
Thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
So Kaytlin, nearly a year ago now, back in March, on episode 20 of the show, we spoke with Jody Rothfield, Seattle casting director, and heard about her experience casting for film. What are some things that are unique to casting for a repertory theater?
Yeah, so Seattle Rep, which used to be called Seattle Repertory Theater, the history of a repertory theater was generally a repertory theater was had a company of actors who would do plays or shows in rep. One that still exists and is pretty well known is Oregon Shakespeare Festival has a company of theater or of actors, and those actors perform in multiple plays there each summer. And that used to be the model for a lot of regional theaters. Most theaters that have repertory theater in their name, that was their model at one point. And most theaters that have that no longer operate with that model. For us, we haven't had a company of actors in, I think, almost 30 years. So each season we are casting per each show. It's actually pretty rare that we have an actor that does more than one show in the season. And if that happens, it's entirely coincidental. We also don't perform our shows, quote unquote, in rep. That would mean like sort of like one night's Hamlet, the next night is Much Ado About Nothing. And then you go back to doing Hamlet and then Much Ado About Nothing. And that would involve sort of switching out the sets, resetting for the other show. Once again, Oregon Shakespeare Festival still operates this way. But what we do is we have two theaters. One is a small 250 seat kind of jewel box theater. The other is a large 800 seat proscenium theater. And we will have shows playing on each stage at the same time, but we're not switching out sets to toggle between shows anymore. That was a model that worked, many years ago, and for a variety of reasons, just didn't make sort of sense all around anymore. So essentially, when I'm casting, I am thinking about the season holistically. We do 9-show seasons, so I'm thinking about doing, all the shows in the season, but I take them show at a time. So I'll really concentrate on this show, who's directing this show, what are the specific needs of the show, which is a blessing, because I know it's very challenging to kind of cast actors based off of what they can bring to multiple shows in the season.
Now, how do you do your research for casting? Do you work with local agencies? Do you have a method of finding local talent? Certain things you look for, that a certain something that someone has when they're on the younger side that is going to be something special?
So, it's interesting that you spoke with Jody, who does TV and film and print in Seattle, because the agencies certainly exist in Seattle for those mediums, but there's not really agencies locally for theater. My correspondence is directly with actors in terms of the representation. They represent themselves. That's not true in other markets. So when I am coordinating with actors in New York City or actors in Chicago or LA, I'm typically going through agents in those markets. But our local actors, it's just a direct communication. And I go and see as many shows as I possibly can in the before times, which I've heard referred to as BC, like before COVID. I would usually see like at least 2 or 3 shows a week. And I would take notes on who I saw on those shows, actors that were new to me or actors that were doing something very different there. And I have some databases that are set up at the rep that I keep those notes in. And then we do general auditions, large scale general auditions, where anyone's allowed to come in and audition. I go to showcases from the local schools, whether it be the MFA program at the University of Washington or Seattle U undergrad program. I'll try and see as many as I can to get to know younger folks that way. And then the other large scale thing we would participate in was the unified auditions that were held at Theater Puget Sound, which was like a 4-day, we would see like 500 actors within the course of 4 days. And we always tried to attend those as well, just to see, who maybe had just moved here, or, we weren't finding through other avenues.
You mentioned in other markets that they have agencies and there are none in Seattle. It's kind of surprising to me, given the amount of theaters and amount of venues in the Seattle area, the amount of people participating, that there's not. Do you think there's a reason that there's not? And is it something, I would imagine if there were, it might help your process?
Well, I mean, it depends on what you are using an agent for as an actor, from an actor's point of view, and like why you would need an agent. A lot of times, actors have agents so that they have a kind of like validation point. In New York, it's really hard to get seen for an audition if you don't have an agent, and if you don't have, if your agent isn't with, a certain agency too. So there, it's sort of a practicality, just because the market is so flooded that you really need to have that kind of like stamp of approval, for lack of a better term, to say like, this is somebody who is talented, worth bringing in. And in Seattle, while there is a large, amount of theater happening here, the number of people that are sort of coordinating that casting is really not that much. It's me and a handful of other people in town. And we don't require the stamp of approval. Our stamp of approval is like, you were great in that show, and you have done your due diligence, show up prepared for auditions, et cetera, et cetera. So it just depends on what some people have agents to specifically for negotiating their terms in a contract. That's something that they really rely on an agent for. That's certainly an important thing. And, some people actually in Seattle, some actors here will have agents that are booking them work throughout the country. So if I'm reaching out to that actor, I'll reach out to them directly, but their agent is the one that's like submitting them for work in New York or in DC or in Chicago. It was kind of keeping an eye on other places, and they keep an eye on Seattle. And those are actors, who are happy and comfortable and willing to travel and be out of town for large portions of the year.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of actors may think that you absolutely must have an agent to get work. It sounds like if they're interested in stage work, that's not necessarily the case.
In Seattle, no, absolutely not. And I mean, and it's very rare in Seattle that I reach out directly to a local actor and they sort of send me to their agent. It's only happened a handful of times.
So speaking of travel, I guess we're talking BC. We're all looking forward to PC post-COVID. I guess it's DC now during. But prior, did you do a lot of traveling around the States, taking in shows? And if so, how did that just inform your work coming back for new play development and eyeballing shows for the future for the Rep?
Yeah, I did do a lot of travel, and I did a couple different kinds of travel. So at the Rep, we cast roughly, I mean, this really depends on the season, but we cast about half of our actors locally, and about half of our actors from what we just say out of town. And when we go, quote unquote, out of town, we typically will use a New York based casting director. Now, that New York casting director is still pulling talent from all over the country. They're asking, actors in LA to submit, actors in Chicago to submit, but they're just based out of New York. So in the BC times, I would often go to New York, take trips to New York for auditions. And, when I was there, I would try and see as many shows as I could and meet up with as many artists or, artists that are based there that I, didn't get to sort of see in person otherwise. So those were pretty frequent trips. I would go to New York for auditions at least probably 3 times a year. And then I would also take trips for specific like new play festivals, which are not always based in New York. Oftentimes they are in much smaller cities. So I went to Louisville, Kentucky for the Humana Festival a few years ago. Right before the pandemic hit, I was in Denver for the New Play Summit at Denver Center. And, that was a really great way to sort of see new play readings, get to meet a bunch of playwrights at once, and then also just get to meet a lot of other new play professionals, people who are dramaturgs or on staff at theaters or agents, playwright agents, so it was a kind of hybrid community building, networking, and also, seeing new work that might be of interest to the Rep in the future, type of trips.
2 to 3 shows a week, traveling to New York and around the country, seeing shows. Once the COVID thing blows over, you let Greg and I know if you need interns, okay?
Right. Yeah, definitely. I know it's pretty lovely. And in times when the sort of, I've still been working from home. I'm still working from home now. And in times when it starts to wear on me, I just remember your job is different when it's full on.
Well, as the theater community deals with the pandemic and COVID, there's been a new focus and one that's been a long time coming on understudies and swings and things like that. And Hugh Jackman, famously now, made news on Christmas Day when he, called out the understudy that filled in for Sutton Foster in Music Man and made a nice statement. A lot of other people have followed suit with that. Given this new focus and just understudies in general, how does the pandemic especially, because you've got quarantines and you've got people that might miss a couple of weeks because of exposure, things like that, how does that affect your job in trying to cast for understudies or just in general?
Yeah, so previous to the pandemic, the Rep Seattle rep would understudy musicals and one-person shows. We would also understudy children, so anyone that was under 18, or we would double cast children, so they would have alternating performances. And it was something that we had sort of had on the list of things that we wanted to revisit and to try and amp up was our understudy coverage. But the pandemic kind of forced our hand in many ways there. But it was something that really needed to happen regardless, because actors should be able to call in sick. I think theater in general is an industry where a stage manager would show up and call the show from their deathbed in order to keep the show going. And I think there's a lot of positions like that in theater. And I think it's really important that people are prioritizing their health, period, not just when it's a contagious pandemic. And so there was a real issue with actors feeling like they could never call out to rehearsal or performances. So we have now decided to understudy all of our shows. So every actor on stage will have an understudy covering them, so that, God forbid something happens, that they don't feel like they are, putting a screeching halt on the show moving forward, that there is coverage, and that's if there is a COVID outbreak within a company and a large number of people in the company test positive, that is not to say like we'll do a show with all understudies on or something, like there's a point where it's like you still have to cancel the show. But this at least gives us more breathing room. And I think in the future, this is not something that's just going to be a policy during COVID. We're going to continue to do this just for that reason, exactly that. If an actor trips and sprains their ankle, that they don't have to, go do a show that night with their ankle the size of a softball, because there's somebody there that is ready to go on.
Does the typical understudy, do they usually learn more than one role, so you could have an understudy that bounces around from 2 or 3 potential fill-in spots?
Sometimes. So it just depends on when it's appropriate. So for like large musicals, we'll often have what's called a swing, which is someone that can swing into multiple roles off stage. So we certainly have that. And then, on our straight plays, it just kind of depends on what the needs of the play are. There might be roles where it would be very difficult for the same human being to cover 2 roles, whether it's because like one is 18 years old and one is 65 years old, or, whatever the factor is. And in those cases, we always strive to have the understudy be appropriate for the role. So there are a couple cases in our upcoming season of our straight plays, one understudy covering 2, smaller parts in the play. But yeah, it really depends on the scale of the project.
And I think people are more understanding, especially now. I think I saw it was Lion King. I think that you had one of the understudies for the children. I think it was young. I might get this wrong, but young Nala came in and played young Simba, but actually came out dressed in just an outfit and a script, and people were fine with that, because it's just strange times, and knowing that yes, the show must go on, but we all want to be healthy about it.
Yeah, and I think we have to sort of judge what the sort of threshold is for maintaining the integrity of the show. If you are forcing the show to go on and it doesn't meet the level of excellence that we strive to meet, you have to kind of make a judgment call on whether you should move forward, and that's not because the understudies are in any way subpar. Understudies are, let me just go on record and say, understudies are the most talented, hardest working people in the industry. So it wouldn't be due to that. But, if it's like, we actually, their understudy is sick, or their understudy is covering a different role, and so we're sending somebody on with a script in hand, it's a point where you have to kind of judge, is it worth it to continue with this performance if it's compromised in that kind of way? Or and sometimes the answer is yes, sometimes it is worth it. It's going to be a tricky call every time.
Well, Fannie is opening soon, the 19th of January. We're excited to see that. And we're also excited at the possibility of interviewing Shanice Omar, understudy for Ife Butler, who plays Fannie. A one-woman show, obviously. And so we hope you don't have to deal with any of that stuff.
Yes,
we're sure
me
Shanice
too.
is incredibly talented, but I guess you kind of hope that the understudy isn't needed.
Yeah.
But a talented lady, we understand, and we're curious when casting for especially for a biographical show like this. You've got Bruce coming up at the end of the season, young Steven Spielberg, things like that. What's more important to a casting director, that the actor resembles the character physically, or that they're capable of bringing the character's personality, mannerisms, behavior to life?
For me, it's always the latter. I'm much more interested in somebody understanding the essence of a person, a real life person, because in the end, we're telling a story, and we need somebody that understands the character, which sometimes the character and the real life person, while it's based off of that person, they can have differences. You are telling a story that has a beginning, middle, and an end, and you kind of need to understand the scope of that and to formulate a character that works within that. So a sort of carbon copy or an impersonation of a real life person doesn't always really work in that. So for me, I always am looking for the latter, somebody that understands the role of that real life person in the frame of the story. But it really can depend on the director's vision for it too. So if there is a director that feels like, it is really vital that we find somebody who resembles that real life person for the story to work, then, that can be the exception. And the examples that you mentioned in our upcoming season, Fannie was a really interesting one because Cheryl West, who is the writer of Fannie, wrote it specifically for Ife Butler, who is starring in Fannie. And Ife and her had worked together many times. And, Ife is perfect for the role, but it has really been crafted towards her. And while she, I would say, bears some resemblance to Fannie Lou Hamer, it is much more about the energy and the essence that she brings to the character. And I would say the same for Shanice as well, the understudy. It carries so much of the essence and, a little bit of resemblance. And also it's a depiction of Fannie Lou Hamer. It sort of explores her life throughout her entire life. And of course, she looked different at different points in her life. So that's another place that you're sort of trying to kind of adapt to that. And Bruce is similar. Bruce, which is about the making of the film Jaws, has a lot of well-known living legends, film legends in it. There's Steven Spielberg and Richard Dreyfuss and Roy Scheider. So it has these sort of iconic figures. And I think actually, one of the things that Donna Fiore, the director of Bruce, has talked about is that we're not a documentary. We're not creating a documentary. This is a musical where
Right.
Steven Spielberg regularly breaks out into song. It's not a documentary.
Unlike reality.
I would imagine. I don't know him personally, but maybe on West Side Story.
I was going to say maybe, yeah.
But we are creating an imaginative world, and so as long as and if we're trying to create a sort of like impersonation of those people, it can really can kind of put you in a corner in terms of what the possibilities are in that world.
Well, you wear many hats at the Rep that we talked about in your bio and we've talked about throughout this interview. How did you prepare for the role that you have? What in your experience and outside work and focus is prepared you for the position that you're in now?
Man, it's interesting because I have a position that doesn't exist in a lot of theaters, and it sort of straddles a few different departments in a way that makes a lot of sense to me, actually. Like, I see all of the overlap between my jobs, but you don't often see this position in regional theaters. And my training was in directing. So I came to theater, professional theater, thinking sort of big picture, like a director would, in terms of all of the components that come together to make a play work. And my entry point to the rep, I was actually a former intern at the rep. I started as an intern there, and I was a casting intern. And this was, you can't study casting in your undergraduate. Like, there's no casting major. So I didn't really know what I was getting myself into. I didn't know anything about it really. But I quickly found that I really loved it because it was a lot just about relationships, maintaining relationships and getting to know people and thinking imaginatively about possibilities in plays. And all of that was really, really appealed to me. So I started at the rep as a casting director, but I was also, freelance directing on the side. And most of my focus as a freelance director was on new plays. I was largely doing new plays, world premieres. And so I had this kind of second life that was all around new work and playwrights. And I was also casting all of our new play development at the rep. So I was still like interacting with our new play development as a casting director. So when, some things shifted at the rep and we really needed somebody to head up the kind of producing of our new play development, I was like, if I had a little bit of support in the casting, so it wasn't, entirely me, then I could really step into both these roles. And they actually align very beautifully in a lot of ways in terms of, I think one of the first steps after a writer has written a first draft is to bring actors into the room and sort of curate who are the minds that you want here and who are the people who are going to help you take this play to the next level. Playwrights are really a type of writer that can't create something in isolation. They need other bodies to really fully form their work and to make it, something that exists outside of their own heads. So it was, it was sort of like an organic process that kind of, and a lot of learning along the way, trial by fire in many instances. So I don't know necessarily how to talk about the preparation, but I do think that one thing that has really served me is just trying to read a lot of plays and having a good sort of sense of, both classic American writers, classic writers in general, classic works, and contemporary writers, who those writers are. And, it's always wonderful when there's a curveball thrown my way and I'm like, oh yeah, actually I read a play of theirs, like 5 years ago. I'm remembering it now, So that's one thing I do to really just try and stay grounded in the work. And, even if I read a play and I'm like, I'm not sure I like that play, it's still not a loss. You'd be amazed at how it will come back around at some point.
Well, we're lucky enough to have a lot of stage folks in our audience. Is there an official route that an actor would take to contact you if they're interested in auditioning for something at the rep or, dipping their toe in professional theater in Seattle?
Yeah. So there's sort of two routes depending on whether you're an equity actor in Seattle, which is the Actors Union, Actors Equity Association. So if you're a union actor, we are a LORT theater. And so for every show that we hold invited auditions for, we will hold what's called an EPA, an equity principal audition, which, we'll send out to your inbox every time we post. And those are held usually at least once or twice a year, depending on our sort of flow. And that's where anybody who's a union member can audition for us. Currently, those are being held virtually. So it's a self-tape that you send in, which has pros and cons, depending on who you are. In BC times, we would hold those in person and you could come in and have an appointment and come be seen in person.
Now those aren't for a specific show, right? Those are just general auditions, and then if you find that there's a match for one of the 5 shows that season, then you'll align that actor with that show. Is that how that works?
Well, this is a little bit in the weeds, but if we are sometimes, so we will audition a show before we announce our season. And in that instance, we don't want to send out like a big casting announcement with our whole season because we don't want to leak our season out before we formally announce it.
Sure.
And sometimes we don't have the whole season yet when we're casting the show. So we're just not ready. So in that case, I'll hold an EPA for a specific show if I'm not ready to announce the season yet. So that's why I say it usually happens. And that's pretty frequent actually now, because we've almost moved to being like a year-round theater company. So it's frequent that I'm casting like the first show in our next season before we've announced it.
Okay, sorry, I interrupted your response on the non-equity.
Oh yeah, and so if you're a non-equity actor, we also hold non-union generals. Those obviously won't be announced through the union, but we usually hold them right at the same time that we do our large union generals. This is something that is shifting in the pandemic, but I would highly suggest, one thing that we're doing now is always posting it on our social media and on our website. So I would highly suggest giving our the Seattle Rep social media a follow, because you can definitely find it out there. If you're in Seattle, becoming a member of Theater Puget Sound in the past has been a way to find out about auditions. Many auditions we're posting there. That's one thing that might be shifting, but it's still too early to tell. But I would definitely follow us. And the other thing too, I always recommend that people let us know when they're in shows. And it can be even a kind of small thing. If you feel like you're doing good work, reach out to us and say, hey, I would love to, I would love for you to come see me in the show. We always try and accommodate that. Like I said, I go and see 2 or 3 shows a week as my, in the sort of typical times, because I want to see people. Sometimes the best stuff you see is like the tiny thing, and there was like only 8 people in the audience, but some really good work happening. So yeah, that's always my recommendation, is to definitely go to those big general auditions. I know they can seem sort of like a waste of time, but I promise you they're not. There's so many examples I can give of people who I didn't know came into a general and blew me away and brought them in for the show, and then they booked the show. So definitely recommend that. And then definitely recommend reaching out and letting us know. I mean, the thing I always say is, like, you're running a business and the business is you as an actor. So like, marketing is huge, reminding people, if you didn't get called in for a show, it doesn't mean that that person didn't like you. Like, did you remind them that you exist? Like, that's an important thing to do. I try and do as much as I can to track who's in town and track everybody. But there are definitely people that fall through the gaps there. And I am always grateful when somebody reminds me that they exist.
Send a thank you card after the audition.
Yeah, yes. Always a lovely gesture.
Yeah. Well, Kaytlin, this has been great. We really enjoyed our visit over to the Rep last December, meeting with Braden and Elizabeth, and we're looking forward to taking in some of the shows this year. Greg's going to be doing some reviews for our Facebook page, and this has been a great education on a really cool position you hold.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. This has been so fun.
Thank you to our guest, Seattle Rep Associate Artistic Producer and Director of Casting and New Play Development, Kaytlin McIntyre. For more information, tickets, and to keep up with all things Seattle Rep, visit their website, seattlerep.org, or search them up on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. All linked in the show notes.
Get your tickets now for Fannie, playing through February 13th, and visit our Facebook page for Greg's review of this powerful and thought-provoking show. If you enjoyed this show, please make sure to follow us and share the podcast with a friend or two. Tell them to find us at heilmanandhaver.com and tune in on Apple Podcasts, Amazon Audible, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and Pandora.
And you can keep up with all of our latest on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and check out special segments like Get to Know a Theater and In the Mix on YouTube. Happy New Year, and as always, thank you for supporting local theater and for joining us on Heilman and Haver.